My ex-business partner tried to frame me for tax evasion, so I framed him for money laundering. 3 years ago, I thought I had found the perfect business partner. We met at a networking event downtown, both of us nursing overpriced cocktails and complaining about our dead-end corporate jobs. He had this infectious enthusiasm about starting something together, and honestly, I was desperate for a change. We shook hands that night, and within 2 months, we had registered our consulting firm. Everything felt like it was falling into place perfectly. The first year was incredible. We complemented each other beautifully. I handled the technical side while he focused on client relationships and sales. Our revenue grew from practically nothing to six figures, and we were landing bigger contracts every month. I remember feeling so proud watching our bank account grow, thinking we had actually cracked the code. We even started talking about expanding, maybe hiring our first employee by the end of the second year. But somewhere during our second year, things started shifting. He became increasingly secretive about certain client meetings, always having excuses for why I couldn't attend. Initially, I brushed it off as him trying to impress clients with his solo expertise. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts when I noticed discrepancies in our client invoicing. Numbers would change between drafts, and when I asked about it, he would wave me off with some explanation about last-minute client requests. The real alarm bells started ringing when I discovered he had opened a separate bank account for the business without telling me. I only found out because our accountant accidentally copied me on an email about transferring funds. When I confronted him, he claimed it was just for easier expense management, but his body language told a completely different story. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds. Things escalated quickly after that confrontation. He started questioning every decision I made, undermining me in front of clients, and generally making my life miserable. The final straw came when he suggested we should dissolve the partnership because we had grown in different directions. I was hurt but relieved, thinking we could part ways amicably and maybe salvage our friendship. That naive hope lasted exactly 2 weeks. I received a certified letter from the IRS informing me that I was under investigation for tax evasion. According to their preliminary findings, I had allegedly underreported income by over $200,000 over the past 2 years. My blood ran cold as I read through the documentation. Every piece of evidence pointed directly to me as the sole responsible party. The investigator assigned to my case was a stern woman who made it clear she had seen every trick in the book. She showed me bank records, transaction logs, and client payment histories that painted a damning picture. According to their evidence, I had been systematically diverting client payments into personal accounts and failing to report the income. The most damaging piece was a series of emails allegedly from my business account, instructing clients to send payments to various offshore accounts. I knew immediately that my former partner was behind this elaborate setup. The timing was too convenient, and several of the alleged transactions corresponded with meetings I had specifically been excluded from. But knowing something and proving it are two entirely different things. I spent my life savings on a tax attorney who basically told me that while the evidence looked suspicious, it would be nearly impossible to prove someone else had orchestrated the whole thing. The investigation consumed every aspect of my life for months. I couldn't sleep, could barely eat, and started having panic attacks whenever I saw government vehicles. My family thought I was losing my mind when I tried to explain that I was being framed. Even my closest friends started looking at me differently, wondering if maybe I really had been skimming money. The isolation was almost worse than the legal troubles. During one particularly dark night, I was going through old business files, desperately searching for anything that might help my case. That's when I stumbled upon something interesting in our shared cloud storage. My former partner had been sloppy with his folder permissions, and I still had access to directories I probably shouldn't have. What I found there changed everything. Hidden in a subfolder labeled Personal Projects were dozens of documents that painted a very different picture of our business operations. There were contracts with clients I had never heard of, invoices for services we had never provided, and most importantly, detailed records of payments flowing through multiple shell companies. It became clear that while he was framing me for tax evasion, he had been running a sophisticated money laundering operation right under my nose. The documents showed a pattern of fake consulting contracts with companies that existed only on paper. These shell companies would pay our firm inflated amounts for non-existent services. Then the money would be transferred through several more fake businesses, before ultimately landing in accounts controlled by some very questionable individuals. Based on the transaction amounts and frequency, we were talking about millions of dollars flowing through this network. I spent the next 2 weeks carefully documenting everything I found. I created spreadsheets tracking every transaction, printed copies of all the suspicious contracts, and even found email chains discussing how to make the money transfers look legitimate. The most damning evidence was a series of encrypted messages, where my former partner discussed the best ways to make dirty money appear clean through our legitimate business operations. But I knew I had to be careful about how I used this information. If I simply handed it over to the authorities, my former partner could claim I had fabricated everything to deflect from my own tax issues. I needed to find a way to make the evidence appear to come from an independent source, someone who couldn't be accused of having ulterior motives. The solution came to me during a sleepless night of pacing around my apartment. I remembered that one of our former clients had complained about discrepancies in their invoicing, specifically mentioning that they had been asked to pay significantly more than what their contracts specified. At the time, my partner had convinced me it was just a billing error, but now I realized it was probably connected to his money laundering scheme. I reached out to this former client, carefully explaining that I was concerned about potential financial irregularities that might have affected their company. I didn't mention the specifics of what I had found, just suggested they might want to review their payment records for any unusual patterns. Within a few days, they called me back, clearly agitated about what they had discovered in their own files. This former client had kept meticulous records of all their business transactions, and they had noticed several payments that didn't match their contracted services. More importantly, they had received instructions to send certain payments to different bank accounts than usual, always with explanations about temporary banking issues or accounting updates. They were now worried that their company might have unknowingly participated in some kind of financial fraud. I suggested they might want to consult with a forensic accountant to review their records, and maybe consider reaching out to the appropriate authorities if they found anything concerning. I was careful not to directly influence their decision, but I made sure they understood the potential seriousness of the situation. Within a week, they had hired a professional to conduct a thorough review of their financial relationship with our former company. The forensic accountant they hired was thorough and professional, exactly the kind of person who would ask the right questions and dig deep enough to uncover the truth. When they requested access to our business records for their investigation, I was more than happy to provide everything they needed. Of course, this included access to the shared cloud storage, where all those incriminating documents were stored. It took the forensic accountant less than 2 weeks to piece together the money laundering operation. Their report was devastating, documenting a systematic pattern of financial fraud that spanned nearly 2 years. They found evidence of shell companies, fake contracts, inflated invoices, and money transfers that clearly violated multiple federal banking regulations. The report concluded that someone had been using our legitimate business as a front for washing dirty money. The former client was understandably upset to learn their company had been unknowingly involved in potential money laundering. They immediately contacted federal authorities, providing the forensic accountant's report as evidence of the suspected criminal activity. Within days, multiple agencies were involved, including the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and the Treasury Department's Anti-Money Laundering Division. The investigation moved quickly once the authorities had the forensic evidence. They obtained warrants to seize financial records from all the banks involved, and within a month, they had traced the money back to its original sources. It turned out the funds being laundered were connected to several ongoing criminal investigations, including drug trafficking and illegal gambling operations. My former partner was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his apartment. I wasn't there, but I heard from mutual acquaintances that he was completely shocked when federal agents showed up with handcuffs. He had apparently been so focused on framing me for tax evasion that he never considered someone might discover his own criminal activities. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The charges against him were extensive: money laundering, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, violation of banking regulations, and several counts of wire fraud. The prosecution had evidence showing he had processed over $4 million in illegal transactions through our business and several shell companies. His bail was set at $2 million, which he couldn't afford, so he remained in federal custody. Meanwhile, my own tax investigation took a dramatic turn. The same evidence that implicated my former partner in money laundering also proved that I had been systematically excluded from the financial decisions that led to the alleged tax violations. The IRS investigators could see that the offshore accounts and suspicious transactions were all connected to my former partner's criminal network, not any legitimate business activities. My tax attorney was amazed at how quickly the case against me collapsed once the money laundering evidence came to light. The IRS formally dropped their investigation within 2 months, issuing a letter stating that I had been cleared of all suspected violations. They even apologized for the inconvenience and stress their investigation had caused, though that felt like cold comfort after everything I had endured. The best part was watching my former partner's reaction when he realized I had been the one who exposed his money laundering operation. His attorney tried to argue that I had fabricated the evidence as revenge for the tax investigation, but the forensic accountant's independent discovery of the documents made that argument impossible to sustain. The prosecution could prove that the evidence had been found through a legitimate business review, not planted by a vengeful former partner. During the pretrial proceedings, more details emerged about the scope of his criminal activities. He had been working with organized crime groups for over 3 years, using legitimate businesses as fronts for washing their illegal profits. Our consulting firm was just one of several companies he had compromised, and authorities estimated he had processed over $15 million in dirty money through various schemes. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic. The evidence was so overwhelming that his defense attorney spent most of their time trying to negotiate a plea deal rather than challenging the charges. The prosecution had bank records, email communications, witness testimony, and the forensic accountant's expert analysis. There was simply no way to argue that he hadn't been running a sophisticated money laundering operation. He eventually pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation. Even with the plea deal, he was facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The judge made it clear during sentencing that financial crimes of this magnitude required serious consequences, especially when they involved organized criminal groups and compromised legitimate businesses. I testified during the sentencing hearing about the impact his actions had on my life and our legitimate business operations. I described the months of stress, the financial costs of defending myself, and the damage to my reputation and relationships. The judge listened carefully and seemed genuinely concerned about how innocent business partners could be victimized by these kinds of schemes. The final sentence was 18 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 12 years. He also had to pay restitution to all the victims of his schemes, including the legitimate businesses he had compromised and the government agencies that had investigated his crimes. The total restitution amount was over $6 million, money he obviously didn't have. After the sentencing, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I was grateful that justice had been served and that my own legal troubles were finally resolved. But I couldn't help thinking about how different things might have been if he had just been honest from the beginning. We could have built something legitimate and successful together, instead of this nightmare that destroyed both our lives. The aftermath took months to fully process. I had to rebuild my professional reputation, explain to family and friends what had really happened, and figure out how to move forward with my career. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about trust, due diligence, and the importance of staying involved in all aspects of any business partnership. I eventually started a new consulting practice, this time as a sole proprietor with very clear boundaries about financial transparency. I also became much more careful about vetting potential business partners, requiring extensive background checks and references before even considering any kind of formal partnership arrangement. The most satisfying part of the whole experience was knowing that his attempt to frame me had ultimately led to his own downfall. If he had simply dissolved our partnership amicably, he might have continued his money laundering operation for years without being caught. Instead, his decision to attack me had created the chain of events that exposed his criminal activities to the authorities. Looking back, I realized that sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their own actions. I didn't have to fabricate evidence or create false accusations. I just had to make sure the truth came to light. His own greed and dishonesty had created the evidence that destroyed him, and all I had to do was help the right people find it. The experience also taught me that justice doesn't always come quickly or easily, but it does tend to find its way to the surface eventually. My former partner thought he was clever enough to frame me while hiding his own crimes, but his overconfidence became his weakness. He underestimated the power of careful documentation and the dedication of professional investigators. Today, I'm running a successful consulting practice that generates honest income through legitimate services. I pay my taxes correctly, maintain transparent financial records, and never have to worry about federal agents knocking on my door. Meanwhile, my former partner is sitting in a federal prison cell, probably wondering how his perfect plan went so spectacularly wrong. The whole experience changed my perspective on business relationships and the importance of integrity in professional dealings. I learned that short-term gains achieved through dishonest means inevitably lead to long-term consequences, and that the best business strategy is simply to be honest, transparent, and ethical in all your dealings. Sometimes I wonder if he ever realized that his attempt to destroy me had actually saved me from being unknowingly involved in his criminal activities. If he hadn't tried to frame me for tax evasion, I might have continued as his business partner for years, potentially becoming an unwitting accomplice to his money laundering operation. In a strange way, his betrayal had protected me from much worse consequences. The final irony is that his plan to frame me for tax evasion actually required him to create extensive documentation of financial transactions that ultimately proved his own guilt. Every fake invoice, every diverted payment, every shell company transaction that he used to build his case against me became evidence of his own criminal activities. He had essentially documented his own crimes while trying to frame me for lesser offenses. I still receive occasional updates about his case through the victim notification system. He's apparently not adjusting well to prison life, and his appeals have been consistently denied. Meanwhile, I'm building a legitimate business that I can be proud of, surrounded by people I trust, and sleeping peacefully at night knowing that I've done everything ethically and legally. The experience taught me that the best revenge isn't about getting back at someone. It's about living well and succeeding through honest means while allowing natural consequences to take their course. My former partner destroyed himself through his own greed and dishonesty, and all I had to do was help the truth come to light. That's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.